Welcome to the third in this series of videos about harmonizing Bach chorales. Now we've moved on to the stage where we can look at some very typical imperfect cadence patterns that we find. Just a word to start with about this word imperfect. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with it. It simply means not complete. The difference between a perfect cadence and an imperfect cadence is simply the degree to which the phrase feels complete, and that's to do with its actual ending point. So in a perfect cadence, we end with the tonic, the home chord, and therefore we feel like things have come to some sort of close. With an imperfect cadence, we have ended on the dominant chord, and therefore there must be an implied continuation. Now there's various ways of getting to the dominant chord. To approach it either tonic, so we go 1-5, or we go via the supertonic, so we go 2-5, or we might go via the subdominant chord and go 4-5. So 1-5, 2-5, and 4-5. But perhaps more importantly than that is to think about what happens with the bass line as we approach the cadence. So in these few examples, I'm going to show you some fairly typical ways in which a phrase might end implying an imperfect cadence, and we'll look at ways in which we can harmonize these, typically in the style of Bach. The first two examples you can see on the screen at the moment are related to each other. And again, I've used this notation here to show the scale degrees in the melody, and the bold type indicates the strong beat. So here we are. I'm going to get you, first of all, to listen to this and see if you can write down, first of all, the bass part in this progression. And of course you can pause that and rewind it and replay it as many times as you like to get that. Now I hope you've heard and realized that the bass has, at the start of this progression, a rising scale. So you're using this feature of passing notes. Passing notes in the bass are something you should always look out for opportunities to include. Why do these passing notes work? Well, because we are basically going from the tonic chord here, we are in B flat major, the tonic chord in root position, through an arpeggio, and the chord taking us on that step in between the tonic and the dominant. This one, this is simply the first inversion of the tonic chord. So in simple terms, we're going from 1 to 1B to 5, and we're filling in that journey of a fifth with a rising scale in quavers. I'll play that again, see if you can do the middle parts. They're really quite straightforward. So I'll let you replay that as many times as you like to include the alto and tenor. And now I'm going to show you the alto and tenor parts. So as you can see, there's very little activity in the upper parts. We can focus everything on the interesting movement in the bass. So here we are with the top three parts in what I call sat together spacing. So sat S, A, T, the top three parts nice and high, collected together as though you could play them all together with your right hand, while the left hand plays the bass part, for example. And we can simply repeat the chord, and then you'll notice that as the soprano moves down a step, so too does the tenor. So here's the complete phrase. And you notice as well that the alto simply repeats the F, binding the texture together with that repeated note that's in common between the tonic chord and the dominant chord. Now, you may already have guessed the relationship between this and this. So I'm going to simply play this example, the second example now, without further comment, for you to see if you can write down the bass and indeed the rest of the parts. replay if you like. Okay, we'll reveal the whole of that now, because I think you've probably got this fairly simple example well understood if you've heard it several times. So we have exactly the same bass line, and all we've done above the bass is to reallocate notes from this progression into different voices here. So what we had here as the tenor is now the soprano, and what we had as the soprano is now the alto. What was the alto is now the tenor. Notice again, I've got this sat together spacing, so the top three parts are as close as they can be to each other. That's not the only way of treating the spacing of a chord, but it is one that works very well if the bass is quite active and moving through a large interval. Okay, so there we have two related versions of the same basic shape in the bass, which takes us from the tonic to the dominant via an intervening first inversion of the tonic chord. Looking down now, here we have another fairly commonly encountered pattern where the melody descends 4-3-2. So clearly that's going to imply rather more different chords than in our first examples, because we don't have the repeated note at the start. So we know already, don't we, that this note is going to be harmonized by an F major chord, the dominant chord. Listen carefully to the first example and see if you can write in the bass part. And you can pause and replay. And now I'll show you the bass. Okay, so again, some sort of passing movement is implied here, but I want you to listen very carefully now again to the first beat and work out what's going on in the middle voices, because this is slightly more complex than a simple passing note motion. And if you've replayed that and tried to write in the middle parts, you, I hope, will have noticed that both the alto and the tenor also move in quavers under that E-flat crotchet of the soprano, suggesting that what we have here, in fact, is more than just a passing note in the bass. That A implies a chord on its own. It is perfectly possible to have two separate chords in quavers in the space of one crotchet beat. And indeed, that's one of the aspects of the richness of Bach's writing, that we often find this. So I'm going to reveal those middle voices again now, and we'll look at that in some more detail. So let's look at the very beginning of the phrase. We've got, perhaps unsurprisingly, harmonizing the E-flat, we have an E-flat major chord. It's in first inversion. Okay, so the E-flat here is first of all treated as though it were the root of chord 4. But when we get to this point, we can see that we've got a different situation. Okay, there are 4 different notes here, and a little bit of analysis will reveal that what we've got, in fact, is an F dominant 7th chord. There's the root, there's the 3rd, there's the 5th, there's the 7th. So we have treated the E-flat, first of all, as the root of an E-flat chord, secondly, as the 7th of the F chord. And that makes this move in towards the tonic chord here a rather more powerful, because we've approached it via its dominant. Okay, now this works well in first inversion. I would recommend you do not try that in root position, because you will tend to find problems with parallel fifths if you do that. Notice we're fine here because the two lower parts are traveling parallel thirds. And if you look at the interval between the other parts, the tenor and the alto are in fourths with each other. There's nothing wrong with that. That's absolutely fine. And obviously, if we look at that in another way, you can see that you've got parallel sixths between the bass and the alto, and that's fine too. However, you might not always be able to arrange the parts in that sort of way. So I'm going to play you another version of exactly the same phrase. You will find that everything is really very, very similar, but you need to listen carefully to the tenor and alto parts, which will be slightly different from the first version. Here we go. And please pause and replay that if you'd like to. And now I'm going to show you the complete harmonization. As before, it's the same shape in the bass, exactly the same as before. And you can probably see here that the alto is exactly the same as we had in the tenor, just simply transposed up one octave. The tenor, however, is different. It is slightly different. You'll see that it's actually starting from a G, an octave above the bass, and therefore doubling the third. And again, this is a situation where doubling the third is absolutely fine. And in fact, it is the only way to carry out this progression successfully, because I will just show you this. If we'd started in the same way here as we had with the alto on the E flat, you'd have had this situation where there's a perfect fifth between the tenor and the alto, and then again another one. As we know, consecutive fifths are not allowed, so you must try and create some contrary motion here against the bass. So this progression is perhaps even more useful than the previous one. It has the benefit of ending up with this chord spaced in an even more successful way with a larger interval at the bottom of the texture, rather than this where we've got a third, a sixth, and a fifth. Here we've got an octave at the bottom, and then a third, and then a third. So here we go, full progression. Just worth saying here as well that, you know, do not be afraid of the tenor singing a G. This is absolutely fine for the tenor. The tenor lives really in the space between this G and this G, generally in Bach Chorales, so that will work absolutely fine. Okay, now we're going to look at some examples of imperfect cadences in minor keys, because this throws up a couple of other interesting and typical possibilities. I'm going to start in the same the key with the same key signature as B flat, so in other words we're going to G minor. We're going to start with a minor version of this 4-3-2 melodic descent. Okay, now I'm going to play this for you and see if you spot the very special thing that happens in the second beat. Okay, you might want to pause that again and have a think about it. Now, the final chord, we're just going to think about what chord we've actually used there. I think it's pretty much given that we know that's going to be a dominant chord. Don't forget that in the dominant chord we must, of course, raise the third of the chord because it's the leading note. So here we've got F sharp, and that'll be in the alto. And we pretty much know that the first chord is going to have to be subdominant. So now we've put those steps in the bass, see if we can write in the middle part. Okay, so you will have noticed, I hope, that we've used a chromatic alteration of the bass in order to make this rather intense sounding chord on the way up to the D. So let's reveal the rest of the harmony at the start of the bar. Here we have our C minor chord, chord 4. So we've got chord 4 gradually approaching chord 5. The chord in the middle is this. Notice how the bass and tenor converge on the same note, doubling the root at the end there. This is probably about as high as you'd normally expect a bass to go in a Bach chorale, by the way. Okay, so what is this chord here? Well, this is a diminished 7th chord, okay, and it's one of the chromatic chords that Bach will use quite commonly, particularly to create a sense of tension that has to be released as we move in towards the cadence. So looking at it, how do we explain its function here? Well, the root of a diminished 7th chord always acts as a leading note. You imagine here that this C sharp is a leading note into D. Imagine the scale of D, and this is the 7th note of the scale. And in a minor key, you'll find that the 7th built on chord 7 is always diminished. So all these intervals above the bass are minor thirds. It's a kind of symmetrical chord. We have minor third from C sharp to E, natural, another minor third from E natural to G, another minor third from G to B flat. And then look at the way the notes, the individual parts, resolve on their way out of this diminished 7th. Everything squeezes inwards further. So the C sharp resolves upwards to D, the B flat, the diminished 7th away from C sharp, that pulls downwards to A, and in parallel with it, the G moves downwards to F sharp. Okay, so it's as though we've taken this chord and we've kind of squashed it, we've compressed it from both ends. So we've taken the top note and moved it down a step, and we've taken the two bottom notes and we've raised those both by a semitone to create that rather more compact chord that can only really resolve by moving inwards again even further. So look here at the contrary motion between the bass and the soprano. Okay, so that use of a diminished 7th as a step between chord 4 and chord 5 is a very handy maneuver for this particular 4-3-2 progression if you're in a minor key. Doesn't really work in a major. Now here's another very characteristic minor key progression involving this time the melodic line rising 3, 4, 5. So the 5 here, the D, that's obviously going to be the root of a D major chord once again, but listen carefully now to how the bass line gets there. How do we get to that D chord? Okay, pause and rewind so you can listen again to the bass. And now I'm going to show you the bass part. Notice yet again that I've used a parting note to fill in this gap of a third. We started from a tonic chord in root position, and the chord here is chord 4, but notice how we've used it now in first inversion. So 4 to 5, but in first inversion, 4B going to 5. This cadence has a particular name that derives from this semitone step. And it's sometimes known as the Phrygian cadence because the Phrygian mode is the one which begins with a semitone step. Imagine a white note scale on E. So I'm just going to add to this description with the title Phrygian. So Phrygian mode, Phrygian cadence, and let's now try and write in the middle voices. Again, you can rewind back. And now I'm going to reveal the whole progression. Okay, you can see, can't you, here, that we have exactly the same pattern as in the alto. Notice that that is 8/8/7, which is the same kind of patterns we started this whole sequence with in the soprano part. So a lot of these voice leading patterns are quite interchangeable, worth remembering that. Okay, now in the tenor you can see we've moved from D, so we have here a fifth, then a sixth, and then a fifth. Okay, we do not have the option here of moving the tenor up to D because that would make a parallel octave with the soprano. And also we're going to have to be very careful not to put a passing note in here. The reason being is here we've got a sixth. If you move the C down to a B flat, we'd end up with a fifth, and then we'd move to another fifth. So you really must not put a passing note in at that point. Okay, so we've now got several different types of imperfect cadence on this page. The thing that they all have in common to a degree is the relationship between the soprano and the bass. I'm just going to review these very quickly. These examples all show us how important the notion of contrary motion is, but especially between bass and soprano. So in these two, the bass rises while the soprano moves down by step. And in those we saw the bass moving up towards the tonic as the soprano moves down, just leading into the tonic. And then in the last two, we've got two kind of opposite situations. This first one, the parts move in towards each other. And in the next one, you can see the parts moving outwards from each other. So the kind of independence of lines produced by contrary motion is very typical in Bach, and it's also, incidentally, a very good way to minimize the risk of writing consecutive fifths and octaves. Right, that is the end of our little presentation about imperfect cadences. Thank you very much for watching.